Good morning, everyone. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of some of that history, including that project that I ran when I was head maths teacher at St Leo's College up at Wahroonga, and then step it into assessment, and I then jump, I guess, forward to today. And I guess where I am at the moment, I'm not actually in a maths classroom, and I haven't been for about 3 or 4 years, but my recent learning has been whole school, and it's through the whole school learning where a lot of the maths has really started to make sense. So, to backtrack, for me, that moment when I discovered I thought I had it all right, but I actually got it all wrong, was in my second year of teaching. And as most young teachers, I thought I was pretty good at what I was doing. We were having some success and being very clever. I was teaching a pretty good Year 8 group, a sort of a 10 standard at the time, and a Year 11 or Year 12 Maths and Society. And it so happened that on one particular day, the planets aligned, and I actually went in to the same class and taught the same thing to all 3 classes. And I was so, at the time I thought I was sort of this, super hot teacher. I managed to cut all this preparation out, and I gave the same worksheet to each of these kids. I gave this area of a triangle was the topic. We did it in Year 8, we did it in Year 10, and we did it again in Year 12 all on the same day. And of course, at the time I thought, fantastic. But it wasn't until a couple of days later, and I suddenly went, what's gone wrong here? Because if we're doing the same thing in Year 8 as we are in Year 12, and guess which year group was the best at it? It was the top Year 8 group that actually snapped through it faster than the 10s and the 12s. It just rang alarm bells for me. So from that day on, I was sort of passionate about, I've really got to research what it is that makes kids learn and understand mathematics. So if we want to jump forward a few years, I moved into a different school about 10 years later, became maths coordinator in that space. And it was a good opportunity in that the school at the time was undergoing a bit of a school review. The school principal at the time wanted all the KLA coordinators to really focus on the teaching and learning. And we had a maths department that looked like a lot of maths departments, I guess, at the time. Teachers saying Year 11 and 12, what are we going to do with them? We're not getting the results we want. Our SNAP results, which for those of us, probably not many of you that actually recall SNAP. Yeah. SNAP was the pre-NAPLAN literacy that we used to run in Year 7 and Year 8, years and years and years and years ago. But it wasn't, the results weren't where the school wanted them to be. They were around the average, a little bit below average, and they'd sat there and they'd been consistent for years and years and years. Students weren't on task, teachers were saying, we've been told to differentiate. How do you differentiate out of a textbook? All sorts of things, general lack of enthusiasm. So the principal said, you're in the job now, fix it. So all right, time to fix it. I was lucky because as well as being empowered by the school to fix it, it was also the time of the new syllabus, which I think was 2003, yeah. So it was also the time where we actually had to rethink. And at the time, the teachers said, well, new syllabus next year, what textbook are we going to buy? And I thought, oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So we got all the sample textbooks from the 10 or 12 publishers. We put them all in, and we did a big sort of plus and minus. What do you want out of a textbook? What is it that we need? And yes, the drill and skill came up, but when it came down to it, the teachers actually self-identified that actually the textbook doesn't do what we want. So we made a decision, and I sort of directed the conversation in the right way a little bit, that we weren't going to use it. And everyone said, all right, what are we going to do instead? And I tell you this story because this is where my understanding of assessment really comes from. What we did instead was focus on these sort of ideas, which again are ideas that are still around. We're still talking about it. But it's the idea of we're not going to do the chalk and talk anymore. Okay, we're going to get technology because it was that time, early thousands, when technology in schools was starting to pick up. But the big one was the games and the playing and the playfulness. How do we do that? Because that's where we see students being engaged. And the concept of best quality and resubmission of tasks. If a kid has handed something in and they haven't done their very best and they're not proud of it, what do we do with that? And the idea that, well, let's give it back to them and say, are you sure this is your best? And until you can look me in the eye and say, sir, this is my best work, I'm not going to take it off you. And it's amazing when you put kids on the spot what they do. They'll take it back. They said, no, it's actually not my best. Can I hand it in tomorrow? Absolutely. And kids would go home and they'd rewrite and they'd resubmit and they'd redo it and they'd bring you back and they'd look you in the eye and smile and say, now it's my best. And just that was phenomenal. Self-peer evaluation. But the other thing we said is that every single thing we do is going to be accessible. Now that doesn't mean everything goes in a mark book, but it means everything is accessible. So some might be just the teacher looking. observing competence. But there was no activity that happened that wasn't part of the ongoing scrapbook of assessment. So we developed a whole lot of units of work. Every unit of work contained 2 pages and then a whole folder of activities that went with it. Front page looked like that. That was our sort of, tick the compliance. This is so we know what's going on. Nothing terribly innovative around that. But the program of work itself looked like that. Now, for each one of those points, there was an activity or a game or something that teachers were given in this big portfolio. So it took a lot of writing, and I had a really enthusiastic team of people at the time that got in there, and we spent a lot of hours writing. But everything was an activity in itself, and that was the teaching program. And what do you know about the teaching program? Firstly, there was no content listed in the teaching program. So teachers actually didn't exactly know what it was they were doing each lesson. Teachers were a little bit nervous at first, but once they got the idea that, well, actually, I don't have to do much planning because someone else is doing it for me, they jumped on, and it actually went pretty well. So it was just an activity-based, a playfulness feature, theme with activities. This is what happened. Our SNAP results, as I said, had been pretty consistent years and years and years. This was the number of students. We had 171 in Year 7 in 2004. That was the number of students accessing the high band in that year, and it had been consistent for multiple years before that, roughly the same number. In 12 months it went to this, same group of kids tested 12 months later. Blew us out of the water. No one expected that. No one expected that at all. And it stayed there for the next 3 or 4 years. In fact, it stayed there, unfortunately, until I left and the new coordinator came in and decided that they really needed textbooks again. And guess what happened? 3 years and it was back to where it was. To the extent that the principal at the time, I'd actually moved out of Sydney, and the principal actually organised a holiday and came and visited me up on the north coast and said, what do I do with this? We'd moved it from here to here and now it's gone back. So it was really sad. But that happened in a year and that stayed there. And what do we do? Well, if you take textbooks away, if you remove all the content out of the programs, if you remove the need for the teacher, because these are all self-sufficient activities, could have been any teacher in the room. It didn't have to be a maths teacher. It just had to be someone that could read the instructions. You took that out, add in a few games, and we got improved outcomes. Makes us all feel pretty useful, really, doesn't it? So then the next step, obviously, is to firstly ask the question: do maths teachers really know how to teach maths? And I've been asking that question for a long time, and I still say, as a maths teacher of nearly 28, 29 years, no. We still learn every single day as to what it looks like. But the real learnings were these: that what we did do didn't happen in the classroom, it happened before the classroom. It was the design of the learning activities is the crucial bit. Design, that word is now in that syllabus document. It is crucial that it's the learning that is designed. And assessment, because we assessed everything, it's actually part of the learning. And we, in my head, very conscious decision at that point, we move away from that summative assessment and the mark in the mark book, because that only serves teachers and makes our lives easier, because yes, we have to produce something at the end of the year to work out who gets first, second and third place. But it's not helping the students. Okay, and then the motivation comes from things being relevant, being active in the classroom, and by seeing their achievement. So because we're assessing all the time, students are seeing and monitoring their own growth. They actually get to the end of the week and can monitor, well, actually I've learnt this week and I am better this week than I was last week. And we often don't do that in maths, because often in maths we do a topic and a student does an end of unit topic test and we get a mark and then we move on, and we never actually go back and track that online growth, that long-term growth. And because we were doing that all the time, students were getting excited by the fact that I'm getting better at this. I actually really like it. I want to do more because I'm seeing for the first time I'm going from here to here in maths. So they were the big learnings. I was successful for a couple of other reasons. Number one is that there was nowhere for kids to hide. Because these activities were now class group activities, we set up our rooms very, very differently. There was just physically nowhere where you could hide in the back row and put your head down and, I guess, pretend to be working. There was no copy and pasting, and by copy and pasting I mean that where I started as a maths teacher, where we put some theory work on the board and we tell the kids to copy it into their book, and we put our worked example on the board and we tell our kids to copy it into their book, and then we get them to do some exercises which are exactly the same as the worked example with some substitution of numbers, and there's actually no engagement in that process. Kids can do that and they can have their headphones in and be looking out the window and still be really successful. And then, come test time, students will tell you, I can do this in class, sir, but why can't I do it in the exam? Well, the reality is you never actually engaged in the classroom. You did a copy and paste activity in the classroom. So that copy and paste idea of it doesn't need to be there, And students could monitor their progress. Okay, that's the history. I don't want to spend any more on the history because I want to get to now. In that time, I've had a few other roles. I've had sort of head of curriculum roles. I've done some external consulting in and out of lots of schools. Done a lot of work and a fair bit of research as well. And I guess the thing with our educational research is it is bombarding us so quickly at the moment. There is so much out there. So you've got to be really, there's a skill in deciphering what's relevant and what are you going to pick up. For me, this is a few of the things that I've picked up over the last 10 years. And it's been really supportive, I guess, because a lot of it was what we were talking about back in 2003. Whoops, that'll be the wrong button. I really like the understanding by design work. And I'm understanding it because Jay McTighe, if anyone's ever heard him speak, focuses in on the teacher as the architect. Your role as an architect, your role as a designer. And that's where your energy needs to be, in that preparation, in that finding of the gains, not in the delivery, in the classroom. The concept around these guys' work is around teaching understanding, not teaching content. And that's a really hard shift when we've got a syllabus that's packed with dot points. It's to get away from that I have to teach this, and we're moving into understandings and teaching understandings. So I really like this stuff. It gets rid of these questions. All right, this is a misunderstanding, classic misunderstanding. And if you think about the way you've taught decimals in the past, you could probably understand how a kid could say this. You know, Dad, how can 4.28 plus 2.72 equals 7? Because 7 is not even a decimal. You know, and you think about, how do we teach decimals? You think, well, actually that's a misperception that kids could pick up. That helps with all of that. Most of you have probably seen the famous TED Talk that Ken Robinson did back in 2005-2006 where he talked about changing educational paradigms. Again, the thing in here that grabs it, and if you haven't seen it, go and YouTube it because it's so worth it. He says a lot in there, but he also talks about producing kids in batches. The most important thing about a kid is their birth date. And again, in a maths classroom or in our schools, that's what we do. We push them in year 7 and we pull them out in year 12. And our activities and the learning throughout there doesn't necessarily align to where students are up to. We teach them and move on. So this and what Ken has to say in there is something, again, is stuck in my head all the time. We're living in this age of information overload. Students get distracted, but what happens when they get distracted in class? Well, they just get in trouble for getting distracted in class. You know, there's so much there. So, Ken Robinson, big influencer in where my assessment thinking has gone. The divergent thinking work, and again, Ken refers to this a little bit in that same TED Talk. We talk about divergent thinking, that ability to ask, you know, what if, what are the possibilities? And the research that was done in England that basically says that, you know, at that age 3 to 5, kids are at their highest level. Once they get older, they start to lose that ability to question, to do the what ifs. When we get to adulthood, the average for these same kids that were tested was down to 2% of them could still think at that same level they could think at when they were preschool. What's happened in between? 18 years of schooling, 13 years of schooling. Okay, has happened in between. It's hard not to blame the school in that. And I'm not blaming the school in that, not at all. But you've got to start to ask some questions. If the kids are there at that age and they're here after we've educated them, what's gone wrong? So it sticks in the back of my mind all the time. How do we get and encourage that thinking to continue all the time? Technology, so much research around now, not around technology, but around the actual brain research and the understanding that these kids we're teaching are wired differently, especially to me, but to most people in the room as well. What do we do with that? How do we acknowledge that research? And how do we always remember the potential that students have? Okay, we treat year 7s when they come into school, and again I'm speaking from my own experience, as the babies of the school. And we forget that 12 months earlier they were school captains and leaders in the school they had come from. And kids can do it. When we set the expectations at the right level, it's amazing what they will rise to. So much of it is about expectations and that challenge to go and do the hard things. We've seen Hattie's work, okay, phenomenal stuff in all that data. So again, all of those high impact pedagogies that we've seen, we've talked about, we've read about, they work when we work out how to really implement them well. So that's been a strategy in there. But probably the biggest one is the idea of creativity. Even things like use of colour, use of music, as we saw before. What can we do in mathematics? Because when you see that, you go, yeah, there's things there to look at. But when you go into math, you see this. And there's a huge difference between the inspiration that comes with that and that, you know? So how do we tap into this? How, as maths teachers, do we get here? You know, what can we do? Final question, and it's one I'm grappling with at school at the moment, because I've come into a school at the beginning of last year and I'm asking lots of questions, as new bosses do in places, and I'm talking about the role of the school. What is our purpose? And is our purpose around HSC results and marks? Or is our purpose around the skills for life beyond school? It's actually both. But as a school principal at the moment, my push is the other side. And when I talk about data, my ex-student data, where are my kids 12 months after they've left? Where are they 5 years after they've left? What's my first year university dropout rate? That's the thing that I'm interested in. That's the one that I'm interested in. It's not the HSC results. They will look after themselves. And they honestly will look after themselves if we focus on that next step. So, what are the skills? The skills we saw this morning from Eddie are the ones in the circle. But it's bigger than that as well. It's a bigger set of skills. And how do we incorporate it into here? So, when we're talking about assessment, we're talking about motivational assessment. This is my key thoughts. Every assessment task has got to be an opportunity for student reflection, because that's where we learn. We learn when we stop and we reflect on what we have done. If there's no reflection opportunity, there's no validity in the task for students. As teachers, we can still get a mark and put it in our mark book, but there isn't the learning opportunity for students. From that will come growth. Because unfortunately, we do topic tests at schools, we get a mark for the topic test, and we move on, and we never go back and we fix that deficiency. Our kid gets 70% in their algebra test, and we're now moving on to geometry. When is the chance to go and fix that missing? We don't. We leave them there at that 70%, and we move on, and we move on, and we move on, and we move on. Now that is really hard to do, because our scope and sequences in our syllabus document, they don't allow it. So we've got to think about, well, how do we build it into our assessment so that kids can monitor their growth? So they know that once they get their 70%, they've got a chance to turn it into 80 and a chance to turn it into 90, that it's not forgotten at 70. So that's input. Meaningful feedback is the way to do it. Okay? Meaningful feedback is not a number, because there's nothing you can learn out of a number. You can have two students, they both get 85%, and we say, are they the same? Well, absolutely they're not. One might be a whiz on something and no good at something else. Another one might have skills in a totally different area. So the number isn't feedback. Okay? Number, again, is useful for us as teachers, because it's something we can put in our mark book. Feedback. Okay? The best feedback is actually conversations, is when you sit down with kids and you have a look at their work. That's the best one. A lot of students don't like written feedback. They won't read written feedback unless there's the opportunity to move forward from that feedback. Student choice. They've got to own what they're doing. They've got to have some say in where it is. They've got to be able to make some clever decisions around the type of work that's going to best demonstrate their skills. How do we get that into our assessment? The skills component. And when we're talking skills, we're talking those sort of problem-solving skills, but we're talking about things like collaboration skills. We're talking about how do you deal with the information overload? How do you deal with the content-heavy syllabus that you've got? Right? What's the skill to decipher that, to sort it out? That's a skill. We teach that. And then there's that element of creativity and open-endedness in all our assessment tasks. So for me, that's what I look for when we're building it. What can it look like? Well, I want to, a few clarifications before. What does it look like? Again, for me, do you always need marks on an assessment? Well, my answer to that is no, you don't. Okay, you need marks for a mark book. You need marks to keep Nessa happy when we get to 11 and 12 especially, absolutely. But up until that time, we don't. Okay, I know schools that have dropped marks totally. We need a method of feeding back to students where they are at on that growth continuum. A number is potentially one way to do it, but there's a lot of other ways to do it. Okay. Does it have to be individual? I'm going to say at this point, no, it doesn't. I'm going to show you a sample of a task in a minute. Because collaboration is one of the skills that we're talking about these students needing to be successful in that world beyond school. So if it's one of the skills that we are setting them up for, it's also one of the skills we should be assessing. It should be part of our program. Can an assessment be multiple times? And I'm going to go absolutely it should. Okay. How you deal with that in seniors is a little bit more difficult, obviously, because we've got our nice little neat assessment policies. It gets tricky up in 11 and 12. But we can still write it in. You can still think about ways of doing it. But 7 to 10, absolutely. There's no reason why students shouldn't be given multiple opportunities to go back and improve what they've done and have another go to demonstrate growth.
Yes.
Yes? Yes.
That's right.
Thank you. All right. I'm lucky again because I've got a pretty good maths team in this school. My maths coordinator, Teresa, has been doing some pretty innovative stuff, and she's experimenting with assessment at the moment as well. So she's tried something new this year, and this was a task that we ran with Year 9 about 3 weeks ago. It's a financial mathematics task. It was a group task, so students were working groups of 3. It was an open book task, so they could take in any resource they liked. They could even take their computer and go to the internet if they needed it. Talking was allowed in the task, within your group but not between groups. And it was an attempt at a different marking rubric. So Teresa's, she was pretty proud with this as a first attempt, but we've also had a chat about where does it need to go to, and she's really excited about what's going to happen next. Because of the group, one of the ways she put in, one of the things she built in there to help with the groups that sometimes don't work is team member feedback. So every person had to review their own performance and then look at the performance of each of their team members as well. And if there was consistency amongst that, then everyone got the same mark from the group. If there was inconsistencies in there, then there was different discussions had over how that was arranged. And I actually don't think it happened. I think the kids were actually really honest with it. It was a simulated real context. It wasn't a real context. If you can make maths real, that's even better. So they had a role. They were, I took the page out. It was a financial maths task. They were all assigned the role of a new accountant in an accountancy firm, and there were some jobs that they had to do. So the task was set out with four questions. First one was a pretty content calculation one, and then they got a little bit deeper. But I'm going to just start at the beginning and show you the first one today. Had a marking rubric that looked like this. And again, this was Teresa's first attempt at this one. We've had some chats about where it needs to go next. But what I really like about it is it's not about getting everything right. It's about that, concept of where you are on that continuum of getting things right. Okay? So if you got everything right, you got 4 marks in that first outcome. And most students were getting 3s and 4s there. The communication one down the bottom was the one where there was a little bit more movement. But everyone got a mark out of 12. Okay? We did get a few kids get 12 out of 12, so there's that next step of work to be done in that, because we didn't obviously differentiate the whole way through, but we're first attempt, and that's okay. We'll work on that one. The task looked pretty much like this. It was you're an accountant, you've just started a traineeship, very busy and bossy accountant, and you had a list of jobs that you had to get done today. First one was just a straight pay calculation. Okay, so it was just a calculation question, not much more in it. Not a lot of questions to be asked, not really a problem in terms of having to come up with unique solutions, so that level of creativity wasn't in it, but nevertheless, this is what it was. So the bit in blue was the actual question, I guess. Mr. Nays asked that you check Nancy's pay, calculate if she's been underpaid, overpaid, and by how much. Pretty standard sort of test. Students were given these sort of worksheets, job sheets. So every question they had to hand in one job sheet. It was blank. They could set it out however they wanted. They could design whatever they want. They just had to demonstrate their understanding via whatever method. And then there was the team member feedback. And the feedback that you had to evaluate yourself to say, yes, I stayed on task, or no, I didn't. I am a good listener, and I was able to contribute to the group. And then for each team member, so they then had to do that for each of their team members as well. And the kids' honesty is amazing, because I'll soon tell you if they didn't really focus all that well. In fact, they're harder on themselves than they are on their teammates. That's the nature of our kids. But this was good, because in most groups it actually came back consistent. And that doesn't mean everyone worked well. There were some that were well down the other end, but they sort of said, yeah, actually we probably didn't give it the effort that we needed to. So that honesty came out. This is what it looked like. We set up the school hall. Okay. Kids working in their groups of 3, talking across the groups. Lots of activity. Interesting one there, the teacher, and that's actually Teresa. She's our maths coordinator. The 2, I think, or 3 teachers that were in the room, because it was the whole of the 5.3 cohort, which was 55, I think 55 kids or something. They had agreed on a protocol as to what they could and couldn't say to students. So if students needed help and they needed some unpacking and it was relevant, the teachers could go and sit with them during the assessment tasks and unpack. But they'd agreed what it was going to be, so that message was going to be consistent. And a few kids apparently just needed some. The big comment we had back was there was so much reading. Too much reading. So a lot of the sort of low literacy kids needed the question unpacked and that little bit of reading done for them. That was fine. So the engagement level was actually really good. Okay, there was a nice buzz in the room. You know, when you look at gentle low noise, kids chatting, it was more like a lesson than an assessment task. But kids at the end were actually really happy with it, because the biggest comment, which I haven't put on here, is there was no fear around the task. The ones that normally go in scared of a maths task weren't scared because they had the support of their friends with them. And they felt that they did better as a result of that. So when we fed back, was it better or worse? You know, 67% there said yes, it was better than working on my own. There was a few that didn't like it, and they would potentially be high achieving kids that want to do their own thing, and this is my mark, not anybody else's, so don't make me share it. That's okay. That's okay. This isn't every task. You know, this is not what you do all day, every day. But we definitely had some really positive feedback from it. 85% the task was better because they could discuss. So if you had an idea, how should we? That level of discussion was there. 74% indicated they'd like to do it again. Okay, so relatively positive feedback. Wasn't everybody in, but it was a good start for something different. And for a lot, it was just a change of concept, because that's not what maths is. We don't do this in maths, and now we are doing it in maths, so what's going wrong here? What I really liked about where it was these couple of things. The group focus, because we were actually testing their ability to work together. So that was one of the core skills. Wasn't as visible as I would have liked in the actual marking rubric. So I would have liked to have seen that in the actual rubric as well. There was a level of it being relevant. As I said, it wasn't real, but there was at least a purpose to it. So there was a simulated role. You know, they were simulated accountants. It was a simulated accounting firm. Really nice if you get some real data and work with something that is actually real, and in a lot of topics you can. We're going to talk about that. The open method of solution. You had blank pages, you could do what you like with the solution. Okay, so we weren't doing, 3 marks and 1 mark for writing the formula and 2 marks for, correct substitution and 3 marks for an answer. However it turned out, is how it turned out. And as long as the thinking was demonstrated and the answers at the end were okay, we were good. And again, that marking rubric that didn't look at the nitty-gritty of all of that. It looked at the overall. The other questions were a little bit deeper in terms of what they were asking. But I want to start here because I believe it's here that we can actually pad it out even more. Oh, and the self-reflection tool was an important one for me too. The next step, and what I'm talking to Teresa about at the moment, is to add in some of this stuff, is to add in the multiple entry and exit points. Because while this was 5.3, if we're in year 7 or 8, we've got everyone doing the same course, we want to make something that everybody can do. We want to be extending our top kids. We don't want to be wasting our top kids. And in reality, that calculation question for our top students is a waste of their time because, yes, of course they can do that. You know, we know that. But for some of our lower students, they're going to struggle to get there, and that's almost their end point. So how do you design a task we can go in at a certain level and jump out at a level, but it still actually be valid? What sort of student choice do we have? Now, there's no student choice in here other than the way they set out the actual solution or the way they approached it. The feedback mechanisms here weren't built in. So it wasn't obvious what feedback you were going to get. And I like to see that actually explicitly in there as well. And the higher order engagement, I think we need to go to that creativity step. And a big one for me, and I guess it's a one that I've really grasped hold of in the last few years since I haven't been teaching maths, and that is the value of writing, the value of literacy, of picking up a pen and writing a paragraph. Because that's where we actually demonstrate our understanding. If a kid can get a correct answer, it doesn't tell you if they've understood it or not. It tells you that they've got a good memory. And when they did their copy and pasting exercise, they put it in the right spot so they could go back and they could study from that page. It doesn't actually tell you about understanding, whereas a written paragraph can tell you phenomenal amounts about understanding. So if we think back to the original question, here we go. The original question here, check the pay, see if she's been underpaid or overpaid and by how much. What I would do to this task is I would add in some questions like this. Describe the process. Was the process you used to solve this problem the most efficient? What could you have done differently? It's a couple of sentence answer. Okay? All of a sudden you can't do that unless you can go back and actually evaluate the process you have just done. What was the process? What did I do? What do you mean can I evaluate it? Can you write a clear set of instructions for Nancy so that she can do this by herself every week? How do you pull out what's in your head and what you just did and articulate that in a sense that someone else can pick up and read? I'd be asking things like, when calculating, explain where errors are most likely to occur. Suggest a way to minimise them. So where are you going to make the mistakes? When you want to get to that creation level, make a spreadsheet. That can be part of an assessment task. Do the thing. So set it out so that she just puts in her numbers and it gives it. Now, straight away this becomes an algebra activity. Okay, so we can start testing multiple strands. But I tell you what, if you can write that single algorithm for that spreadsheet, so you understand this. You absolutely understand this. And if it's not that, it's the concept map. It's the infographic. It's a bit of software. You know, for our software writers that live on their computers, they can go away and generate this. That can become part of an assignment because you're demonstrating your level of understanding to get there. What questions do you need to ask Nancy to ensure you have all the information you need to help her? Okay, there is one in there, and one student picked it up because there's an 8-hour shift in that work, and there's nothing about lunch breaks. So one clever little said, well, does she have a break in there, and how long's the break? And that was the question to the teacher. Now, someone's actually switched on. Someone gets it, that we've got to consider other things here. It's not just what's in front of me. So what are the questions that you need to? You can gain phenomenal insight out of those sort of questions for kids. How many different methods could you use? You know, so these are all now higher order type questions, and most of them require some sort of written engagement or verbal engagement. If this was a take-home task, this could be a video presentation that comes back. Could be a speech in the class, could be a talk, could be lots of different ways, but it's the unpacking of this level of question is where we actually really test mathematical understanding. Some other question stems, you know, what are some of the problems associated with? The what dids, the what facts can show, what is the most important part, can you propose alternatives, you know, what would you do if? You know, what would you do if this information wasn't there? You know, they're the sort of questions that kids now suddenly go, whoa, this is different, okay? This is the stuff that we've got to start thinking about. If you want to do something, you can order those questions into what you understand as some sort of system, and I've just used Bloom's taxonomy to say, well, if you have 7 questions You could say your first three are sort of the, basic bottom of the pyramid, that basic understanding. We move into the understanding, apply, analyse, right through to the create questions. And the instruction for every child is you've got to do 3 consecutive questions. So you can do 1, 2, 3, or you can do 4, 5, 6, or you can do wherever. Students straight away, they go, I reckon I can do that one. I reckon I can do 6, but I probably can't do 7. So I'm going to do 4, 5, 6. And then there's that choice then. I know I can demonstrate at that level. Whereas others are going to go, actually, I'm really going to struggle with the calculation. I'm back at 1, 2, 3. But if you want them to demonstrate what they know and where they are on that spectrum, you can pull it out of this, often just through their choice of questions. If the student happens to be in a group, if this is still the group task, and the group decides 3, 4, 5, and the student comes up to you at the end of the lesson and says, I really think I can show 6. Show me 6 and bring it in tomorrow and we'll add it, And they come back a week later and I think I've now got 7. Bring it back a week later. Because if we can move students from 1 to 7, we've now got that multiple entry and we've got that demonstration of growth. It's a really simple thing to do with a set of questions. So, just doing that to that first question, which was a calculation question, we've now got multiple entry and exit points. We've now got some student choice in there. Okay, we've got that opportunity for higher order engagement. There is that creativity element in there now. The what ifs, what will I do ifs, create the spreadsheet. And we're now doing that writing, which is the demonstration of understanding. Okay, so just adding that, for me, you pick up so much extra. Students see their growth, so it becomes exciting to get involved with. Final things that we probably still don't have in are the feedback mechanisms. The resubmission wasn't in that task, and we need to work out how we get that into future. And the marking rubric, I'd like to rework that marking rubric, and we haven't done it yet for this task in terms of understanding, not the content. So what are the understandings of this unit of work, not what are the content dot points of this unit of work. And that's still a work in progress. We're working on that, and I wish I'd had it to share with you today, but it's not quite there yet. So, I guess for me, the whole summary around assessment, it's the learning tool, okay? It's not just for us to be able to conveniently put a mark in a mark book. It's where the real mathematics is done, is in the assessment. Take the risks, okay? Challenge the norms, because you've got to challenge the norms a little bit to make it work. And it's risky, but it normally works out for you, okay? Think like a designer, like that architect. The job is to design the learning as well as delivering it, but it's the design is where the crucial bit is. It's the bit we don't have time for. Okay, it's the bit, and I know I did my years as a maths teacher where I'd sort of do the lesson prep on the way to class and flick through the textbook and see where I was up to, and it was, exercise 8.1 today, so it's 8.2 tomorrow, and I look back and think, gee, I wish I knew what I knew now then, because it's not really working for the kids. Be creative, okay, because there's so many opportunities that we can step away from that. And finally, don't ever lose your passion, because it's just a beautiful science. And when you have it, your students will have it. And when you give them the opportunity to actually do it, not just do the outsides around it, that's when we're going to get the success from it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
What I really like about your presentation is you told us what your beliefs were and what you valued, and you then demonstrated it with an example. Thanks. And then you were willing to critique it and say what was missing from the task and where do we go to next. So I think it was a really great demonstration of those things. So we've got time for a question or two.
Yeah.
Did you assign the students into groups, and if so, how did you do that, and were there time limits on the task?
There was a time limit on the task, though I think it was pretty flexible. I actually wasn't there the day of the task. I was out at some other meeting, unfortunately. There was a time, but I know there was a couple of groups that had an extended time because it wasn't quite there. The kids selected their own groups for this one. So they were in friendship groups. As a first attempt, the feeling was we'd let them do that to see if that helps with the dynamic, but future we probably won't.
I think Ash probably.
Sorry, yep. Yeah, Ash.
When you got started with as a head teacher, this new approach to teaching and all that, were there any particular resources that were quite helpful to help you kind of get started? Because I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of people who want to try and get started. but they don't know what the starting point is?
Yeah, I found a lot of the resources that are around enrichment that we don't tend to look at school. So you know when you go through your textbooks and there's the challenge exercise in the back, and most people, we skip that page and we go on, we pulled out all of them. Because when you look at what all of those are, and again, when we did this, we had, I think there was 10 or 12 different publishers, and we had all these books come in. And again, as maths teachers, and I did it for years and years, we do the exercises, and I'll challenge, no, we'll skip that page. We pulled all of them out. And there's phenomenal resources in that, because it is the problem solving. It is the high level problems. And then the books that are called enrichment, you know, that are the things that you don't necessarily do. You're going to the educational bookshops, and not the ones related to the courses, the ones that are not related to the courses. Some of the overseas resources, some of the American books, phenomenal, because they're not related to our dot points. So they make us think differently.
Okay, and Neil, I think is next.
Yeah, Neil.
So I really liked what you said with regards to being able to have students do their test again, do their assessment again, if they, you know, didn't do as well as they wanted to. How do you do that logistically?
Depends what the task is. Okay, so if it's a task like this, then it's more challenging, because you've got to get 3 people together and you've got to supervise it. But we're sort of setting up spaces in the school where we can do that now. So we're doing sort of assessment catch-up spaces and teachers that can supervise multiple things at a time. It is harder. It's different to sort of putting the kid in a desk outside the classroom, which some of us tend to do, which is not really good practice, but we do it because there's no other way around it. If it's a take-home task, it's obviously very easy. But quite often too, the bit that they can resubmit can be a take-home bit. So they've done the task and they've said, actually, I want to just do this bit again, can I show you? And they've got to say, well, yeah, do we trust the kid? If they're going to go and take it on themselves, do we trust that it's theirs? And sometimes we've got to give them the benefit of the doubt a little bit to say, well, actually, yeah, that's okay. It's not easy. It does require some setup in the school.